A couple months back, I took suggestions for what my most controversial takes are, the takes that people disagree with the most. This was on like a YouTube post, I believe. And I got a bunch of responses, and one of them was Eminence. And I made my Eminence video probably a month or two before that post, so it's definitely in the recent mind of people. And I mean, that video was broadly pretty well received, but there were definitely a lot of people who were disagreeing in the comments and, bringing up issues they had, which I kind of expected because I knew I was defending a controversial mechanic. So that all makes sense. That all is good. And here, I just wanted to go through some of those comments. I wanted to talk about the different disagreements people have with the mechanic and with the arguments I was presenting. And I wanted to give my considerations of those, and in most cases, my rebuttals of those, because I think broadly I disagree with them still, even with a couple months of retrospect. I still think the Eminence mechanic is a pretty fair mechanic that has a lot of room for cool gameplay. So that's what we're going to be doing here. Uh, Joining me is apparently my cat. Say hi to Nico. He wants to be on camera, I guess. Okay. To start with, I want to start off with probably the weakest argument about Eminence, I would say, and that is that the mechanic is inherently unfair. And let's read a comment about that. Hard disagree. The fact alone that one of the players start with an advantage that can be used every turn, cost them 0 mana, and cannot be interacted with is, by definition, unfair. That's why people hate Eminence. So this is the idea that Eminence is, I guess, overpowered, or it's just unfair. It's not reasonable. Uh, and I think this is a very wrong argument, but I think it's wrong in some interesting ways. And it's in some ways that let us peel away the layers of what the command zone is in a game. On the surface, the idea is that Eminence gives you this inherent benefit, and that having an inherent benefit that costs you nothing is very potent. I think an interesting thought experiment is to think, what if we were playing a version of the Commander format where everybody started off with an Eminence effect, or everybody started off with a passive effect, and that is what your command zone is. You get this passive effect. So it's like you have like a hero power in Hearthstone or something, or like a passive hero power. Then you could introduce a version of that effect where you are, instead of having this passive effect, you are allowed to cast a thing. And that would be a valid passive effect because being able to cast a thing is an inherent benefit. Having that opportunity, having that extra card, having that extra thing you can do, I mean, effectively you've drawn a specific card. That is effectively what the passive effect is of, having this command zone thing. You effectively passively have this extra card in your hand. And that is notable. That is a notable benefit. And I think people tend to not think about that. They tend to treat the command zone as this thing that is entirely reasonable and just okay. The cat cannot behave himself, so he is down now. I think people tend to underestimate the value of a traditional command zone. They kind of take it for granted. They don't think about it in the sense of, oh, I always have this one card. That's amazing, because it is amazing. You basically get to tutor for a card for free at the start of every game. Think about it as a totally free tutor and a permanent 8th card slot in your hand. That is effectively what your command zone is. So it is a passive effect in a lot of ways. And I think people tend to not think about that. They just treat their command zone as this thing that is given to them. And they might put like a cool looking creature in it. And that is totally cool. And that is kind of very much within the spirit of the format. But the rules of the format as written, give you access to this creature, and you can put whatever you want there. And I think when you're thinking about how powerful you're thinking of an Eminence commander, you can think about a powerful traditional commander. And I think a lot of the same things are going to ring true. Having access to this one specific card and building your deck fully around it is a very powerful passive effect. I mean, it's active in the sense that you have to perform the act of casting it, but I don't think that's as significant as a lot of people think it is. Now, one counter argument to this you could bring up is that being able to cast the card in addition to having the passive benefit is kind of a notable thing. You have both this passive thing, as my hypothetical would have. You have this passive thing that you always have, as well as this 8th card. So isn't that too much? Isn't having these two things just a little too much? Isn't that the problem with the Eminence mechanic? And this was another line of critique that people had. So I'm going to read off another comment here. Eminence should only work in the command zone. Like, if you want the ability, you leave your commander uncast, but if you want it as a creature on board, it loses Eminence. So this is another line of critique, basically that the problem with Eminence is that you have both this Eminence effect and this creature, and that's just too much. And I think this is kind of striking at the fairness center in the commander player's brain, which I think we all have. I think I talked about in a recent video that I don't think fairness is that important a thing for EDH, but it is still kind of a line of concern you could have within a game. So let's talk about this. I think this idea that you shouldn't have both an Eminence creature and an Eminence effect, there are two problems with it. One of those problems is that I think one of the most valid critiques of Eminence is that it allows a player to not cast their commander, and that casting your commander is a really important part of the commander format. And in fact, in my video, I talked about how I don't like Eminence designs that allow you to not cast your commander, that just give you this passive benefit and totally ignore this casting your commander thing, this all-important part of the EDH format. So that's one problem with this. I think if you institute a rule like this, people are playing this Eminence commander for the Eminence effect. You could design a thing where, like, you want to get a little bit of the Eminence effect and then get the Eminence creature later and lose the Eminence effect. But I think realistically, people are mostly just going to not cast the Eminence creature if they have an Eminence commander, because that's why they picked an Eminence commander, right? So I don't think this sort of change would be good. I think it would just kind of reinforce this issue that we see in some Eminence commanders, like Inala, where you just never cast the Eminence commander, you just get the cool wizard ability or whatever. The other issue I have with this is that I think Eminence designs are at their best when they're designed to be a cohesive whole, when they are balanced to be fair as an Eminence creature plus an Eminence effect, and where their strength comes from both. And I think the Knight commander, Sidar Jabari of Zalfir, definitely a little bit stronger on the realm of commanders, but I think that's a good example of that. The commander on its own is, the creature's pretty solid. It reanimates knights. The Eminence effect on its own, kind of mediocre, kind of okay. It gives you a little bit of extra filtering with knights, but that combined package is really useful, and you want to kind of get those extra loots early on, and then later you want to get those reanimations with Sidar Jabari of Zalfir, the creature. And I think that's a cool design. I think that is a well-balanced design. And I think part of the part of the joy of Eminence is that it gives you access to kind of creating this cohesive whole. I think we can also look at one of the most problematic Eminence commanders, Edgar Markov, as a counterexample to this issue that people have with Eminence. Edgar Markov, the creature, is not very good. Like, it's fine. It's okay. If you're playing a lower-powered Edgar Markov deck, you will be casting the commander. Sure. +1/+1 counters. Love them. But if you're playing a higher-powered Edgar deck, you're not going to be casting the creature as often. You're going to be hitting the table with a billion 1-drops. You're going to be getting a billion 1/1 vampires. You just don't really have a reason to cast the creature that often. You're going to mostly be using the Eminence effect because the Eminence effect is really good and really hard to stop. And that's the problem with the card. The problem with the card is not that you have access to Edgar Markov, the creature. The problem with the card is that the Eminence effect is this unstoppable torrent of 1/1 vampire tokens, and it's kind of very hard to hold back, very hard to stop, and it's just super easy value. So I think this critique of the Eminence definitely strikes, as I said, at the fairness center of the commander player's brain, but it doesn't really address the actual issues with Eminence, and actually specifically is countered by a couple of the key examples of Eminence cards. Another critique I've seen of Eminence that kind of discusses the fairness of the effect is that Eminence, the problem with it is that it is there from the start of the game. You get this free effect from the very beginning of the game, and that is a problem on some level. So I have a comment here that says, I've heard it said in other places, and I will repeat this myself. Eminence should be a mechanic that only gets turned on if you have cast your commander. Then, even if it gets removed, the eminence sticks around. So this would be basically putting a time gate on the eminence effect where you cannot get it until you've cast your commander. And then from that point onward, you get it for free. So it's like this effectively, it's kind of like a planeswalker that creates an immediate emblem in the sense that you pay the cost for it, and then afterward you have the effect. And, that's a thing that makes it come into play a little bit later in the game. My issue with this is that I think all of my versions of what a cool Eminence design is involve the fact that Eminence is available right from the start of the game. I think a very cool thing about the Eminence effect is that it allows you to create a sort of two-tier effect on a commander. One tier is a thing that is always available. This is your baseline effect for the card. And I think we can go back to Sidar Jabari of Zalfair. You always have access to, when your knights attack, you get to loot. That's kind of cool. I like that. That's, having that from very early in the game is neat. It gives you this added bonus early. It's not a super big added bonus, but it is one that exists. And then later in the game, you compound that with your second degree of Eminence effect, or your Eminence creature. And that's cool, right? And I think one of the biggest ways I suggested it could be used is in the case of aggro commanders. Arabo is a great example of this. You get your +3/+3 bonus right from the start of the game. That's like crazy big at the very start of the game. But then over time, the benefit of a +3/+3 bonus to a single cat during your combat phase, that will kind of go down over time. That will become less and less useful. So then to counteract that, you have Arabo the creature, who you play later, and then you get to double the power and toughness of a cat. And the Arabo creature could maybe be a little tuned up. I think most of the power of Arabo comes from the Eminence ability, but in principle, that design feels good, I think. And I think if you institute a rule like this, where you don't get the Eminence effect until you've cast the Eminence creature, I think you lose that. You lose a lot of what I find interesting about the design space of this. You lose this two-tiered thing where you have your early game application and then you have your later game application. And, that's a little bit of a problem to me. All right. I have saved the most popular and I think probably the most valid critique of Eminence for last here. And this is one that came up in 23 comments, it looks like. I don't know. I threw together these comments a couple months ago and then just sat on this not doing it because I didn't feel like it. But let's read one of those. I think that Eminence is a bad mechanic simply because you can't interact with it whatsoever. It just is. It's like starting the game with an emblem. So I think this is an interesting thing to think about. Eminence is bad because, not because it is unfair, not because it's overpowered or anything, but because the play pattern of an uninteractable thing is bad on some level. Having something for nothing is conceptually problematic. Firstly, I think it's interesting to think about Planeswalker emblems as a concept here. Most of them tend to be kind of the final ability on a Planeswalker. So you plus up a Planeswalker a whole bunch, and then you spit out the Eminence, or spit out the emblem, the passive effect at the very end. So it'll be like, whenever an opponent does this, you draw a card, or whenever you cast a spell, you deal 2 damage to something. Something like that. Something that will have like a major effect on the rest of the game that'll kind of give you a permanent leg up. And I think people tend to be okay with these because they hit the board later in the game, and you have to like get through a cycle of plussing up your Planeswalker, unless you have like a doubling season or something, obviously. However, I think what people don't think about as much is that there are several Planeswalkers that have these emblems that you can get the turn you play them. So 3 of them buff up your creatures. So Gideon, ally of Zendikar, can create an Anthem as a -4 on a 4 loyalty Planeswalker for 4 mana. You can just, for 4 mana, have a permanent emblem. That's kind of cool. Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, can -2 to get a +1/+0 emblem for all your creatures for the rest of the game, uninteractable. And he's still alive. He's like a 3 loyalty Planeswalker, I believe. Kaito, Bane of Nightmares, very strong card. This is definitely the strongest of the 3. Kaito can get a +1/+1 for all of your ninjas. And it's pretty easy to activate it multiple times. I think it might even be like a +1 or a 0 or something. Something like that. It's something where you can just activate it multiple times if your opponent isn't dealing with this creature. I think that's very cool as well. In addition, we can see things like Chandra Awakened Inferno. That one has a +2 where it gives your opponents an emblem, and on each of their upkeeps, they take 1 damage for each copy of this emblem they have. So it's kind of this permanent source of damage that they cannot interact with. And I think all of these are cool designs. I think all of these are neat, and they are neat specifically because they are easily accessible, entirely uninteractable effects. And I think one of the reasons that is cool is because it forces opponents to get more creative. And I think we see this sometimes in 60 card formats more often so than Commander. In Commander, you have a lot more ability to kind of flex the game to your whims. If you're playing a more controlling deck, a lot of times you'll just have answers for everything, and you can just do whatever the hell you want. And as long as you have enough removal that you're drawing with your crazy draw engines, you'll probably get there in some cases. If you look at 60 card formats, there are a lot of matchups where you will straight up be forced into a specific kind of play path. You will have to work around something. Like, there are matchups where you will be playing against like a hardcore inevitability control deck, and you will know if this game goes past like turn 7 or 8 and this control player is not like hanging on to life by a thread, I'm kind of cooked. And in those cases, I think it's kind of interesting because you have to like delve into your sideboard and see, okay, how do I put on the pressure early? How do I kneecap them just enough early on in order to not succumb to this later in the game, in order to finish things early? Or even, how do I sideboard in stuff to perform my game plan as effectively as possible? If I know that there's going to be problems later in the game, how do I execute my game plan as well as I can right now? Ditto with like, there will be some forms of aggro where like you know that this deck is going to get this crazy threat on this turn, and maybe you have a way to deal with it, but maybe you need to put on pressure instead. Maybe you need to figure something else out. A lot of times an aggro deck will have some level of average damage that it puts out over the course of a game. And if you're a control deck, 1 in 4 cards in a library are a lightning bolt. If you are sitting at 5 health and you've got control of the board, you've mitigated their threats, you need to end the game now. You cannot just sit on your ass. You need to end the game, or they will eventually draw 2 lightning bolts and kill you. That's just how that works. And so I think it is interesting when there are these kind of problems you cannot solve with just a single removal spell, and that you have to really deal with, that force you into putting down your own game plan right now in order to solve this problem. I think Eminence effects tend not to be quite as much examples of this because we don't see super crazy late game scaling as an Eminence effect. But still, I think it's interesting to have to grapple with, how do I deal with the fact that I'm going to be dealing with an endless stream of this or an endless stream of that? How do I deal with the fact that I really have no way to remove this issue? I have to figure out how to perform my game plan in a way that deals with that. I would say, if this is your issue with Eminence, I would say 2 things to you. For one, I think it is good if us Commander players can be a little more flexible in our thinking, a little bit more flexible in our problem solving, a little bit more willing to engage with different resources and different forms of attacking opponents. Because there are a bunch of different axes on which you can attack your opponents. You can remove a permanent, and I think people really like to remove a permanent. I think there are people who really gravitate toward that, and if they can't remove a permanent, they get frustrated. But you can also attack your opponent's life total. You can attack your opponent's library with mill or something. If your opponent has like a mana discount, you can attack their hand in some ways. Some of these will be more or less acceptable depending on kind of the level you're playing at, the playgroup you're playing in. But I mean, if we're talking about like a powerful Eminence commander, running some discard isn't necessarily not a solution to that. So there are multiple axes on which to attack your opponents. Have a backup plan, have an aggro plan, have a beatdown plan that you can pull out in a pinch. I think that's a really good thing to be able to do. And I think it is satisfying to be able to build a deck that, performs this one specific plan all in, this one specific political mill plan or something. But like, you have a 100 card deck. You fit 100 cards into your deck. Surely there can be some cards that are there to kind of take down opponents in a more aggressive manner. And I have this in a couple of my decks. I have a couple of decks that are kind of more on the grindy side of things, like my Shroom deck, my Rata deck, but they also can pull out this resource that deals a bunch of direct damage, that can, in a pinch, you throw your mana or you throw your effort into this one card that will deal a bunch of damage. And sometimes that's necessary. And I think being willing to have that flexibility is good. The second thing I would say to people who really dislike Eminence due to its uninteractivity is that I am with you on some level. I agree that I think Eminence effects should have enough moving parts that they are interactable ish. They're still going to feel less interactable than some things because the source of the value is not interactable with. You can't shut that down. But if something requires an artifact in play, or some different permanents in play, or some tokens in play, or something like that, a creature attacking, etc., such like, that is still a thing that it's requiring, and that is a thing you can interact with. And I think being willing to kind of expand your mindset of what interactivity is to encompass dealing with the frontmost threats rather than tackling the uninteractable engine piece, I think that's good. And I think that is a level of flexibility that is very reasonable to expect of us as commander players, even if we are addicted to removal spells, some of us at least. I certainly love my removal spells. My first deck was a mono black creature removal pile. But yeah, I think that is kind of my take on the issues people have with Eminence and my responses to them. I still understand why it's a frustrating mechanic, and I think the fact that the mechanic came into existence with some kind of more problematic instances of it, particularly the Edgar Markov, I think that did tend to make it seem more egregious than it is. I think Edgar Markov really emphasizes the uninteractivity aspect super hard because you get kind of this major benefit of getting a token in a black vampire deck, and the only requirement for that is casting a vampire. So I get why that, that being one of the early popular Eminence commanders, I definitely get why that made people kind of leery of the uninteractivity of it. But, at this point in time, I'm open to Eminence designs in the future, and I think you should be too. I think it is a cool design space. I think Sijar Jabari of Zalfir, the most recent Eminence commander, is an interesting design. I think it's a pretty well-rounded design, a pretty well crafted design. And I think if they do more things like that, I think that's pretty cool, and I think that's fine. So that's my take on things. Yeah, Eminence is cool. Print more Wizards of the Coast.